You'll recall from the previous unit the impact that violent struggles for independence had on the post-colonial states where they occurred. The loss of life in Algeria and Vietnam, and the economic impact of war and forced migration in Mozambique, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, for example, was immense. We observed that in the aftermath of those struggles, parties often cast those who opposed their policies as enemies of the state, rather than simply as people with differing policy preferences and viewpoints. This made democratic political transitions between parties incredibly rare. Now we're going to consider the arguments of Frantz Fanon around the question of the nature and the role of violence in the process of decolonization. Frantz Fanon was a French colonial subject born to a middle-class family in the Caribbean colony of French Martinique in July 1925. As a child, Fanon benefited from French colonial schools in Martinique, receiving an education and proving himself an able and bright student. Recall that French colonialism was rooted in the idea of the mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. This idea held that it was the responsibility of France to bring civilization to backwards peoples around the world, to westernize and assimilate them. Under the French philosophy, colonial subjects who adopted French culture and language, who converted to Christianity, and who internalized French values and traditions could become French. When Fanon turned 18 in 1943, he volunteered to fight with the Free French forces against Germany in World War II. Fanon served in North Africa and saw combat in France, where he was wounded at the Battle of Alsace and decorated for his service. After the war, he returned briefly to Martinique before moving to France to study medicine and psychiatry. Fanon completed his residency in 1952. Throughout this period, and as a result of his experience in Martinique and France, Fanon became increasingly critical of the impact of colonialism on the psyche. In 1953, Fanon became the head of the Department of Psychiatry at a French hospital in Algeria. The war for Algerian independence had just broken out, or would break out less than a year later. In 1956, Fanon resigned his position and began working for the National Liberation Front, the FLN, participating in their armed struggle for liberation from France. His book, Black Skin, White Masks, was originally written as his doctoral dissertation. In it, Fanon analyzes the psychological impact of colonialism. The manuscript was rejected by the university, forcing Fanon to write a second book for his doctoral degree. Black Skin, White Masks was published ultimately anyway. In Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon argues that colonialism strips the colonial subject of their identity and self-worth, creating an inferiority complex and engendering a need to adopt the habits and customs of the colonizer. They attempt, as the title suggests, to wear white masks. And yet such practices are necessarily always incomplete, for no matter how well the colonial subject masters the language and customs of the colonizer, they will always still be a colonial subject. Their skin will always be black. Yet as the colonial subject internalizes the colonizer's values, they increasingly view themselves, Fanon argues, and their society and their history as inferior. Their progress is defined by the degree to which they abandon their own identities and adopt those of the colonizer. As Fanon wrote, the colonized is elevated above his jungle status in proportion to the adoption of the mother country's cultural standards. Such a system, Fanon warned, would necessarily create a sentiment both of cultural and of individual inferiority. Fanon saw this practice most clearly during his time in France. When Fanon's unit was ordered to march across the Rhine into Germany, it was stripped of all non-white soldiers. Fanon and other black Caribbean soldiers were redeployed so that they would not be seen by photojournalists covering the story. Fanon and his fellow soldiers would never truly be French, but would always be marked as inferior because of their color. As Fanon would later observe in Black Skin, White Masks, when people like me. They like me in spite of my color. When they dislike me, they point out that it isn't because of my color. Either way, I am locked into the infernal cycle. Fanon's later and more well-known work, The Wretched of the Earth, was published in 1961. It is broader in scope than Black Skin, White Masks, covering the nature of liberation, the role of violence, and the challenges of nationalism and imperialism. It is also more controversial, for in it, Fanon argues that the use of violence in the struggle for independence is necessary for true liberation. Most of the attention usually paid to The Wretched of the Earth focuses on its endorsement of violence as a necessary component of the struggle for authentic liberation. But arguably the most important contribution of the text stems not from its consideration of violence, but rather from its thinking around the limits of the middle class as an agent for political change in the colonies, and for its theorizing of the relationship between nationalism and liberation. As Fanon observes in the third chapter of the book, entitled The Pitfalls of National Consciousness, by a perverted kind of logic, colonialism turns to the past of the oppressed people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys it. The total result looked for by colonial domination was indeed to convince the natives that colonialism had come to lighten their darkness. As a result, Fanon concludes that national consciousness, instead of being the all-embracing crystallization of the innermost hopes of how people, instead of being the immediate and most obvious result of the mobilization of the people, will in any case only be an empty shell, a crude, fragile travesty of what might have been. Fanon warns that the triumphant spirit of celebration that marked the end of colonialism in Africa, Asia, and Latin America would be short-lived. He predicted that the new governments, ultimately rooted in the very colonial system from which they emerged, would be unable to fundamentally transform the political, economic, and social systems of the post-colonial state. Again, quoting Fanon, as we see it, the bankruptcy of the bourgeoisie is not apparent in the economic field only. They have come to power in the name of a narrow nationalism and representing a race. They will prove themselves incapable of triumphantly putting into practice a program with even a minimum humanist content, in spite of fine-sounding declarations which are devoid of meaning, since the speakers bandy about in irresponsible fashion phrases that come straight out of European treatises on morals and political philosophy. Consequently, Fanon believed that the emerging political and economic elites in the newly independent state would continue to wear white masks, aligning themselves with the former colonial power rather than the marginalized peoples of their own countries. According to Fanon, the national bourgeoisie turns its back more and more on the interior and on the real facts of its undeveloped country, and tends to look towards the former mother country and the foreign capitalists who count on its obliging compliance. Fanon thus concluded that successful political and economic development of the post-colonial state would depend first on the development of a national consciousness, a common national identity around which the development project could be framed. We'll return to this idea of national consciousness and nation building a bit later in this unit. Fanon died of leukemia in 1961 at the age of 35. Yet his two books provided some of the most powerful insights into the psychological impact of colonization and on the nature of the post-colonial state. And his theories would later inform the work of people like Stephen Biko in South Africa, and groups like the Black Panther Party and the Black is Beautiful movement in the United States.